Kochtopus, elaborate further.
The Kochtopus, here's a great example. In 2009, when we were debating climate change, my book shows that Koch secretly funded a think tank report from this group called the American Council on Capital Formation. And this report said that if we regulate climate change, it'll be a disaster for the American economy. Then another Koch-funded think tank called the American Energy Alliance took the findings from that report, made political ads, and targeted those ads at Republican politicians like Lindsey Graham, who supported climate change legislation. So now Lindsey Graham has got these horrible campaign spots running back home. And then the corporate lobbyists from Koch will be visiting the offices of Lindsey Graham and explaining why they can't support climate change bill. So the Kochtopus is this remarkably effective 360-degree machine that affects the public debate around issues like this, that has lobbyists to work on issues like this, and that can finally bring voters in. You know, Americans for Prosperity I've been at these events where they bus voters into Washington, D.C., they give them glossy printed protest signs, they feed them a box lunch, they take them to the congressional offices, and they can stoke what appears to be a real public revolt against legislation like this. So, you know, the Kochtopus, as you call it, the political influence machine, really reflects Koch Industries' business itself. It's involved in the granular, complicated business of running our country that's sort of below the surface, and they are truly masters of operating complex systems, whether it's pipeline networks or political operations in Congress.
David Koch died last week of prostate cancer. Well-known right-wing donor, major climate change denier, along with his brother Charles Koch. They are the subject of a new book that was written by Christopher Leonard, our guest today, called Kochland: The Secret History of Koch Industries and Corporate Power in America. So let's go to that chapter on workers and how the Kochs tracked the workers.
Yes. You know, one of the big questions I wanted to explore going into this book is, why have middle-class Americans been treading water economically for so long? We live in a country now where the economy can grow for 10 years, as it has over the last decade, but most middle-class Americans haven't advanced economically. They haven't kept the gains of their hard work. And I'm so curious as to why that is the case. And you just can't ignore the fact that labor unions in this country have gone from, 33% of employees down to 7%. And the book shows labor unions, sure as heck, were not perfect. There were problems back in the 70s. Some union bosses were corrupt. They used violence and intimidation. But when you fast forward to today and see what the world looks like when labor unions have become truly broken and marginalized, you see this picture that I think is frankly disturbing. I spent years reporting on a Koch Industries distribution center in Portland, Oregon, which is operated by Koch's Georgia Pacific division. And I interviewed many of these warehouse workers who'd been there since the 70s, and they described a working life that is increasingly grueling and increasingly difficult. After Koch bought this distribution in 2005, it used this software system called the labor management system that tracks the warehouse workers every second of the day. So they show up at work, they log in, the computer tells them where to go and what to do for the 10 hours they're on the shift, at least until they're done. And not only that, but it tracks how quickly they are doing their job. And what Koch Industries would do for years is that it would publicly post these rankings of the employees, with green tier doing the best, yellow tier kind of in the middle, and the red tier doing the worst. And if you performed at the bottom of your coworkers, you'd be disciplined or even fired. And what this did was it sort of systematically divided workers and made them compete against each other, which went directly against the strength of a labor union, which is everybody bargaining together, and having solidarity. And by the year 2016, you just see kind of a grim picture in this warehouse. I interviewed a woman named Deborah Roberts who was forced to work 30 days in a row without a day off. And on the 30th day, when she was told she would finally get a day off, she broke down in tears. She was so exhausted. And I obtained the labor contracts of these employees going back to the 1970s. I had an outside compensation expert look at these labor contracts. And what he told me is that these employees are earning less money today than they did back in the 1980s when you adjust for inflation. So you really see this picture of American workers being swamped by this pressure to increase productivity and increase profits and having less and less control over their working life.
Christopher Leonard, how they made their wealth, in many cases, it was off the backs of Native American tribes. Explain their business model and why Native American reservations were so important to them.
So this is a pretty remarkable story from Koch's early years. You know, this company has always been deeply involved in the fossil fuel business. And back in the 1980s, Koch was the largest collector of crude oil in the United States. What that means is Koch was the company that would go to an oil well, collect the oil, and then deliver it to market. What U.S. Senate investigators discovered and the FBI discovered in the late 1980s was that Koch Industries was systematically underreporting how much oil it gathered. So to put it in simple terms, Koch would show up at the well, it would take 100 barrels of oil and leave a little ticket behind that said it had only taken 98 barrels of oil. So it's getting 2 barrels without paying for it. I interviewed senior Koch former vice presidents, the oil gaugers who collected the oil. I reviewed transcripts of the depositions of senior Koch executives on this matter, court records, and what it clearly shows is that for years, Koch was systematically taking oil without paying for it. Koch officials admitted in court they reaped roughly $10 million in profit a year from oil they didn't pay for.
So they stole the oil.
Well, I'll tell you what, I use the word stole the oil in my book. I think when you take something without paying for it, it's stealing. For the record, Koch Industries Public Relations Department really disputed that account, and we settled on the term taking without paying for it. But in the book, I do say oil theft. They took it without paying for it for years, and the people I interviewed on the record told me they did it with prior knowledge. They knew they were taking oil without paying for it. And again, it was a small percentage, but it always made sure Koch was on top. They put their thumb on the scale, and they took enough to always be on top. And what's so illuminating about this is that it is a very complex world, this oil collection. You can never quite measure oil perfectly. And Koch would often just, when they were in a gray area like this, push it to the absolute limit and often evade accountability for actions like that.
So criminal charges brought or avoided, and how was that used as a model for how they operated in the future?
The United States Senate investigated this and just categorically showed that Koch stole oil, as they said in a Senate report. The case was then shifted to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Oklahoma City in 1989. I interviewed the senior investigators on that case, the assistant U.S. prosecutor on that case. The investigators were convinced Koch had broken the law. They were trying to push the case higher. The case eventually fell apart. And a big part of that was that in 1989, Koch Industries realized they needed to become more politically engaged. As we've said, Charles Koch was a libertarian. He tried to let Washington do its thing, but he realized that if he didn't have a large political apparatus, he could be the target of investigations like this. So this was when Koch really built the political network as we know it. And Koch began lobbying U.S. senators like Kansas, then Senator Kansas Bob Dole. They began actually lobbying the Native American communities and convincing the local leaders of the Osage community that Koch had not stolen oil. And, Osage leaders like Charles O. Tillman gave comments saying that Koch had not stolen oil, and then Koch's political apparatus would amplify that message in Washington, D.C. And Charles O. Tillman told me later in an interview that he really regretted his statements because he only later realized Koch had, in fact, stolen oil. But these political efforts helped cloud the picture. They painted federal prosecutors as being overzealous, And you really did see the beginnings of a playbook here of this multifaceted 360-degree political effort that seeks to change the public conversation, lobby lawmakers, and help sort of push the regulators back off the plate, if you will.
Chris, we only have a minute, and I wanted to get to a comment you made in your book. In many ways, Donald Trump posed a greater political threat to Charles Koch's political agenda than Barack Obama. Explain.
Charles Koch wants Republicans to be libertarian and back off the private enterprise. Donald Trump has a different vision. It's this America First vision. Donald Trump has made clear he will intervene in markets, whether it's through tariffs, trading up trade deals, or all the rest of it. The Koch political network knows that if Donald Trump wins re-election, he will reshape the Republican Party for a generation. We will have an American First Republican Party, not a libertarian public party. And that's why you see this tug of war between Koch and Trump. Now, Koch supports Trump's efforts to deregulate, but it is fighting him on these other fronts. And who knows where this will ultimately end up.
Well, we're going to do part 2 with you and post online at democracynow.org. Christopher Leonard, author of the new book, Kochland, The Secret History of Koch Industries and Corporate Power in America. Christopher Leonard is a business reporter whose works appeared in the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Fortune, Bloomberg Businessweek. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.